Hello everyone, today we'll be talking about a nuanced topic called racial microaggressions. So you might have heard of this topic before or this concept before, or maybe this is the first time you're learning about this, but we're going to try to basically understand a little bit more about the nuance of racial microaggressions by explaining examples, the different forms of racial microaggressions, as well as the different implications of racial microaggressions in different environments. So we reviewed racial microaggressions in everyday life implications for clinical practice. This was an article by Azusa et al., and they defined racial microaggressions as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. So this is a complicated definition. There's a lot to it, but let's kind of debunk what that means. So a lot of times they are brief, they are in the commonplace, they're daily. That's something to conceptualize. They're oftentimes factored by verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities. So it's a multifaceted part, and they can be a part of every system because environmental, verbal, behavioral is a part of our communication, our interactions with each other, and the systems that we are part of. And a lot of times they're intentional or unintentional. We'll be talking a little bit more about that when we define each form of racial microaggression. They communicate hostile, derogatory, and negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. So it's kind of an emphasis on marginalized communities such as people of color who are oftentimes impacted by racial microaggressions. So I wanted to also cover the ambiguity and nebulous nature of racial microaggressions that oftentimes leaves the perpetrator not doing justice for the victim and the victim not being able to defend themselves. So because racial microaggressions, we had that unintentional and intentional aspect to racial microaggressions, perpetrators might not even know that they're offending that individual by the words or the actions that they're saying. And because it's unknown to the perpetrator, they might become defensive if something is brought up, or they might not even bring it up at all. And because racial microaggressions are so insidious and so ambiguous and confusing for the victim, a lot of times they do not know how to feel, react, or defend themselves, leaving no justice for them and having long-term impacts on their mental health, their psychosocial functioning, a lot of different things to acknowledge. So today we'll be talking about 3 forms of racial microaggressions, which is micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. And then we'll be covering the 4th one, which is environmental micro aggressions, which is more on a systemic level. So my team will be describing those as well as definitions and examples.
So the first kind is called micro assault, and this is considered the explicit racial derogations characterized by verbal or nonverbal attacks utilized in a way that is meant to hurt the victim. I know that was a lot, but pretty much out of all 3 of them, this one is the one that is the most obvious because the perpetrator is conscious of the way that their actions and their words affect the individual. Unlike the other 2, this one is a lot more deliberate and overt, and thus making the actions or like the actual microaggression a lot more aggressive. And so this is what closely resembles what we would consider old-fashioned racism. And it's less common to see nowadays in a more globalized world. However, it still happens, especially in private settings where the perpetrator is able to hide behind animosity. But this does actually happen in public settings as well, especially in 2 different scenarios as listed in the article. So one of them is if the perpetrator feels out of control and they don't think about how their actions and their words would affect a person. They don't care about that. In a second scenario, this can happen in if the perpetrator feels safe and comfortable to be able to engage in such an action without receiving so much backlash or without having so much of a consequence. Yeah, so some examples of this type of action, some examples of a racial microassault includes name-calling, avoidant behavior, or other purposeful discriminatory actions. And so this also goes under, this also includes things like racial symbols or racial slurs. If somebody tries to mock your accent or imitate your accent or language style, if they are holding up, say, a Confederate flag on their car, or if somebody tattoos white power on their chest, if somebody goes out of their way to take pictures or videos of you because they have assumptions about your race, then all of that it falls under the umbrella of a racial micro assault. An example of this as well is in 2020 when they had the Bat Fried Rice t-shirt come out from Lululemon that was intended to really call out Chinese Americans. And so all of these are examples of what racial micro assaults may look like. And yeah, but an important thing to know about these types of racial microaggressions is that because it's so obvious and it's explicitly like intended to hurt a person, the victim actually feels a lot more comfortable handling it. You know, it's not something that they have to feel like, oh, I'm being too sensitive. They know that they're the victim in the situation. They don't have to doubt themselves in that. And so it's a lot easier to confront. That makes it less of a focus in the article, since the article is addressing more of the microaggressions that are a little bit more subtle and the ones where the perpetrator doesn't feel like they're doing anything. And so that is going to be further explained in the next two types.
So the next form of microaggression would be a micro-insult. And typically a micro-insult is characterized by some sort of communication that conveys rudeness or insensitivity. And usually it demeans a person's like racial heritage or identity. And so just to point out that there are different types of micro insults. So you have the ones that are very straightforward, very cut crease. You can tell just by the way that they are said, which are usually verbal. And then we also have other remarks that are less verbal, just more based on your body language. And so I can elaborate a little more about those as well as we continue on here. But basically, behavioral or verbal remarks or comments, they usually convey some sort of rudeness and sensitivity as well. And so overall, micro insults usually are more subtle and they are usually unknown to the perpetrator. So that means that the perpetrator doesn't usually know that they're causing these sorts of microaggressions, but they clearly convey some sort of hidden insult or message to the recipient, who is usually of color. And so micro insults, like I said, can also occur non-verbally. And so that usually means that individuals can sometimes avoid eye contact with people of color. Usually they turn away or just overall fail to acknowledge and demean that person. And so just as an example of this, a lot of times people, especially in the workplace, there are different descriptions of intelligence that sometimes these societal structures place on people of color. So for example, one of those would be assigning a degree of intelligence to a person of color based on their race. So an example of that would probably be saying that an African American or an Asian American or Hispanic American has a certain level of intelligence just solely based off of their color. And then another ascription would probably be the idea of seeing people of color as second-class citizens. And so overall, that makes the recipient feel like less of a person or less of a people group solely because of their race as well. And so going off of that, there's one more that I want to highlight as well, and that is usually the fact that there is an assumption of a criminal status that is pushed on to people of color. And so one of those would be like presuming someone is a criminal or dangerous based off of their race. So a lot of instances in my personal experience that I've seen with that would be a lot of times me as an African American walking down the street, there would be cars parked on the side where people would be in them, and the minute that they see me based off my skin color, they are locking their doors or like rolling up their windows really quickly, just sort of instances like that.
The final form of racial microaggression would be a micro-invalidation, which is often characterized by communications that either exclude, negate, or nullify a person of color's thoughts, feelings, or experiences. Like micro-insults, micro-invalidations are often made unconsciously, so it's really hard for the victim to determine whether they should feel offended or not. However, despite this, perpetrators oftentimes make these micro-insults or micro-invalidations with hidden meanings underneath. A common themes for micro-invalidations would be feeling alien in one's own land, colorblindness, myth of meritocracy, and denial of individual racism. An example for feeling alien in one's own land would be Asian Americans who are oftentimes asked where they're from, or being complimented for speaking good English. This is a micro-invalidation because this implies that they're foreigners, despite constantly responding that they were born here, that they're locals, that they're American citizens. What the perpetrator is looking for is their homeland country. What language do they speak? What is their ethnicity overall? That is a common example of feeling alien in one's own land. Another example would be for colorblindness, would be saying that all lives matter. For the recent movement, Black Lives Matter, it would be wrong if a white person were to approach a protester for Black Lives Matter and ask, why do only Black lives matter? Shouldn't all lives matter? This is wrong. This is a form of a micro-invalidation because this nullifies the racial experiences that African Americans faced in society today. They're bringing attention to the aggressions that they face, the racism that they face every single day in police brutality, in media, and society. That's the whole point of Black Lives Matter. So for someone to say that all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter is negating the whole racial experiences of the entire race. Another example would be if a white person were to make a joke or make an insult towards African Americans, and when confronted, their response is, oh, it's okay, I have friends who are Black, so it's okay for me to say this joke. This is wrong because they're saying that because they have friends that are Black, they're immune to racism. This is not okay, despite what they might think. This is also a common form of a micro-invalidation. Overall, all of these examples have effects that either negate the person of color's heritage or ethnicity and imply that they're foreigners in their own land. They either negates their racial or cultural beings, and the racial experiences overall are being nullified, and that the importance of bringing attention to their racial experiences are being diminished.
Lastly, I am going to explain what environmental microaggressions are. Environmental microaggressions are racial assaults, insults, and invalidations that occur in institutions and organizations within the broader society. Specifically, we are looking at educational and political systems, as well as the larger cultural norms and values of society. An example of an environmental microaggression could be seen in TV shows that feature a predominantly white cast. Some classics that come to mind are Friends, How I Met Your Mother, and Gilmore Girls. Additionally, environmental microaggressions can be seen in movies that cast white actors or actresses in non-white roles. An example of this can be found in the movie Aloha. In Aloha, white actress Emma Stone plays the role of Captain Allison Ng, who is of Swedish, Chinese, and Hawaiian descent. It is important to note that our media consumption impacts the way we view and understand the larger culture of society. Seeing a lack of diversity in entertainment could perpetuate ideals of whiteness and minimize the realities and experiences of people of color. Additionally, it can make people of color feel like their culture is being misrepresented, and it can send the message that people of color don't belong or don't exist. One final example of environmental microaggressions that I want to share is the overcrowding of public schools in communities of color. Overcrowded schools make teaching and learning much more difficult. So the overcrowding of schools in communities of color can send the message that education shouldn't be of value to people of color. And that is all I have for environmental microaggressions.
Overall, racial microaggressions impact the lives of every race, especially communities of color. So it is important for us to remain cognizant and constantly reflecting on our own biases and our own prejudices on other races, so we can prevent and not dismiss the experiences of others, but be able to acknowledge and move forward, in a better direction. So the 3 types of microaggressions that we talked about were microassaults, which can be shown through name calling, avoidant behavior, intentional discriminatory actions. So an example of this can be signs or symbols of racism, such as holding the Confederate flag or calling someone an Asian person Oriental. Micro insults is the second one, which talks about degrading a person's racial heritage or identity through words or actions. And so this can be an description of intelligence as described earlier. An example of this can be telling an African-American student, there's no way you're going to get into that school just based on their racial appearance and racial heritage. A lot of times that can be demeaning and degrading, and that person might feel self-conscious or not even apply. It's a loss of opportunity for that person just based on the color of their skin. Micro invalidations are words or actions that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiences of a person of color. So this can be Asians are forever foreigners myth, or the concept of all lives matter as explained earlier, or even color blindness. Color blindness is a prime example of this, and a lot of times this becomes a thing that the victim feels misunderstood, negated, invalidated, and unimportant in that setting. And so there's a lot of impacts on micro invalidations that is oftentimes hard to see because they might feel very attached to their point of view or their reason, but it still impacts the victim who was offended. Lastly, environmental microaggressions is something we described as well, and this is more on a systemic level, but it constitutes the 3 forms of racial microaggressions, and it's usually brought by persons of power, brought by institutions, organizations, biased representations in movies and shows, etc. Hopefully, this video gives you more information on what racial microaggressions are. If you have any questions, please let us know.